All right, so last week we were looking at sagacity and thinking about how all of that works. And there is, biblically speaking, you could say that sagacity and sanctification were like synonyms, not as they're used in the general public, even in the general church public, but biblically speaking, it is true. Both begin, of course, when God gives us the new heart, and that special kind of fear of God is put into the heart. Then when God gives us the promise or the seal of the Holy Spirit, and we've talked about that many times from Isaiah 11, 1 through 3, how that very specific kind of the fear of God is the center of that. That same specific kind of the fear of God is to hate evil. As we grow in this, we make progress to the root of sagacity and then later to maturity in sagacity. The same kind of growing occurs in sanctification. The New Testament tells us that we work out our sanctification in fear. So all of these things are related to one another. Now tonight we're going to begin a topic. This is only the second time I've taught this publicly. It's about how the fear of God, how Jesus uses the word worship and the word fear as synonyms. We've talked about in the past how if we look at the full spectrum of the fear of God in English, it starts with fear, terror, dread, awe, reverence, worship, and how the fear grows stronger and stronger as we make those progressions from fear to terror, terror to dread. Then starting with awe, we have fear and love together, awe, reverence, worship, worship being the highest form of fear and the highest form of love together at the same time. We've talked about those in previous times. You know, when I say that worship is the highest form of the fear of God, I've never had anybody question me about that. I always expect them to say, why do you think that? Never had, but tonight I'm going to show you why that this is so. So we're going to start in our New Testament, excuse me, with the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4 and verse 8. Of course, we'll recognize the context here that this is when Jesus, at the beginning of his ministry, was led out into the desert to be tempted by Satan. And Satan tempts him in three different ways. The first way was to make bread into stone. Jesus answered, man shall not live on bread alone. The second temptation is whenever Satan shows Christ all the kingdoms of the world and said, I will give this to you if you will worship me. And in verse 8, Jesus answered him, it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Now, Satan is using the word worship to mean like bow down, and that is one of the meanings of the word worship. But Jesus answers him back, quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 13 and 14. So let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Henry Blackaby used to preach from Deuteronomy chapter 6 quite a lot. And he said that Deuteronomy chapter 6 was Jesus's favorite chapter in the Old Testament because he quoted from it more than any other one place. That's what he said. You can take it or leave it. But he does refer to this place a lot. So when we look at Deuteronomy 6:13, where Jesus is quoting back to Satan, we find these words: "You shall fear only the Lord your God, and you shall worship him and swear by his name." In verse 14, "You shall not follow other gods, any of the gods of the people who surround you." So in the New Testament, Jesus said, "You shall worship only the Lord your God," when quoting this place, but in actual fact, it says, "You shall fear only the Lord your God." Now, Deuteronomy 10:20 is a similar statement. "You shall fear the Lord your God, you shall serve him and cling to him, and you shall swear by his name. He is your praise. He is your God, who has done these great and awesome things for you, which your eyes have seen." Now, in both places here in Deuteronomy 10, where it says fear and awesome, and then also in Deuteronomy 6:13, the word fear there that is used is, in English letters, would be Y-A-R-E. It is the most common form of in Hebrew of the word that speaks about the fear of God. In that sense, we can call it like the root word, the general word, whichever word you like best. It is directly related to the Hebrew word to see, speaking about sight. From this understanding is where we get one of the basic definitions of the fear of God, that the fear of God is what we experience when we see God as he really is, and we see ourselves as we really are, and we understand the vast difference that exists between us and God. That is the basic meaning. What the Bible says, that when you do that, when you see God as he is, see yourself, understand the vast difference. The Bible uses the word fear to describe what happens when you see and recognize that. Okay, so we have to ask ourselves the question: does Jesus not understand? Is he making a mistake whenever he quotes the Old Testament?
Not at all.
No, not at all. I don't believe for the tiniest second that he's making a mistake. That's why we say that worship and fear are synonyms in Jesus's vocabulary. Okay. Now then, when we look at Deuteronomy 6:13, we see three moments in that verse. The first speaks about fear. You fear only the Lord your God. Second, in King James, it uses the word serve. And even in the New American Standard, it says that serve is one of the ways you can translate that word. And then thirdly, to swear by his name. So we're going to use for our three moments that Deuteronomy 6:13 is speaking about as fear, service, and swearing. Why are these three things listed in this one verse? And why are they in that order? Okay, so first of all, the fear of God is one of the fundamental characteristics of Israel's worship of God. When Israel was truly worshiping God, fear was one of the primary characteristics. Later on, we're going to see that when you attempt to worship God, and there is none of this holy fear involved in the worship, the Old Testament calls that idolatry, as does Jesus. So that anything that you're calling worship that does not have fear of God as its core, as its fundamental part, is idolatry. Now then, this is not an unholy fear, but a holy fear of God, a very strong form of the fear of God. And it is fear of God and love together. Now, we've talked about in the past, but I think it's worth bringing up again tonight. The fear, terror, and dread of God are primarily based upon, or is primarily our reaction based upon the deeds of God. When we see what God has done. For example, if we were with the children of Israel when they were in Egypt and we had seen the plagues, if we had seen the Passover, if we had been involved in the march as they leave Egypt headed towards the promised land, if we had seen God open up the Red Sea and we cross on dry land and then the sea closes in on the Egyptians, if we had seen the water that flowed from the rock and eaten the manna that came from heaven, the Bible would use the words fear, terror, or dread to describe our reactions, because they're all based upon what God has done, the deeds of God. Now, when we speak about awe, reverence, and worship, this is our response to the character of God. And that is a very important distinction. It is the reason why you will see unholy fear called fear, terror, and dread, because unholy fear is based upon the deeds of God. But there is no unholy fear of awe, reverence, and worship, because those only come to awe, reverence, worship only come to people who have a knowledge of who God is. They have some kind of relationship with God where they no longer know merely the deeds of God, but now they know the character of God. You might remember in the Old Testament, the Bible tells us that the people knew the deeds of God, but Moses knew the ways of God. Knowing the ways of God implies that you know something of the character of God. All of those who merely knew the deeds of God perished in the wilderness. All the adults I'm speaking about. Joshua, Caleb and Joshua would be the exceptions. And for them, they also knew the deeds of God. Not only the deeds of God, but the ways of God. So this is an important distinction. So worship, the fear of God that's called a synonym for worship, is this holy fear of God, this awe, reverence, worship, which is again, a very strong fear of God plus the love of God combined. This is the reaction, the holy fear of a redeemed sinner before the holy God. And this must include love, not exclude it. Only those who have been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, that God has given them a new heart, which of course, as we've seen many times, has this very specific kind of the fear of God in it. Only those can truly worship God. Okay, we also remember that this special kind of the fear of God is the center of the law. We saw that in Exodus 20:20. And it is what is in the heart of the person who has been forgiven of his sins. Look in Proverbs 130. I'm sorry, not Proverbs. Psalms 130 and verse 4. Okay. Proverbs 130 and verse 4 tells us, but there is forgiveness with you, that you may be feared. That when God forgives us of our sins, one of our reactions, and it's a necessary reaction, is we then begin to fear God, because we know and understand that where before we were enemies of God, now we have been forgiven, and based on that forgiveness, we become adopted children of God. So this fear that is a part of worship and a synonym for worship is always a matter of our heart. It's a heart that loves God, that fears God, and then worships him. Okay? So we got worship. Next in the list, and you shall serve him. Now, perhaps we don't like to think about it, but it is God himself who decides and defines what is called acceptable worship. Acceptable service. We may think we're serving God, but until God accepts what we do, and until what we do meets God's standards for acceptable service, then it is merely a dead work. So we fear only the Lord our God. We serve only him, and we swear by his name. Now, before I get away from serving, let's remember Romans 1 and 2, where he talks about your acceptable service. In King James, it talks about your reasonable service. In New American, it talks about your acceptable service. But unless God accepts it, it's useless. And number 3 is swearing in his name. Now, this morning, whenever we went to court, the young lady that was going to testify came and she sat down next to the judge. She put up her hand, her right hand, I'm sorry. My right hand won't get in the picture. Here it is. She put up her right hand and he said, do you swear to solemnly tell the truth in the matters that are before the court today? She said, I swear. Then she was allowed to give her testimony. When we read about here swearing by God's name, this is not merely a solemn oath before a judicial court. Now, it can be, but that is just a small part of what the Bible means by swearing in God's name. This actually refers to the solemn and emphatic declaration on oath in the ordinary conversations of life, by which the true religious attitude of a man involuntarily reveals itself. I'll say that again. This is from Kyle and Delish, and I will confess to you that this is very, very convicting to me. Swearing in God's name refers to the solemn and emphatic declaration on oath in the ordinary conversations of life, by which the true religious attitude of a man involuntarily reveals itself. Now, anybody can come to church on Sunday and for a short period of time pretend to be something they're not. And, you know, they can dress up, look nice, be on their best behavior, sing the songs, pray the prayers, pretend to listen to what's being said. And all those observing this might think, oh, wow, that person is a sincere Christian. Swearing in God's name is the exact opposite of that. This is swearing by God's name is what we really are when nobody's looking. What comes out of us in just the ordinary conversations and moments of the day. And it is revealed, and most clearly revealed, by what we are like when nobody's looking. When we are no longer pretending and we're being our real self. If that is not the same as how we are when we're in God's house, then we are swearing falsely by God's name. Okay, that's a really, really important point. You see, the man or the woman who truly fears God could care less what people think about them. They're only concerned about what does God think. They don't care anything at all about appearing as something before people. They want to offer up an acceptable sacrifice that's pleasing to God. And it is not just merely what they do on Sunday, it's everything that they do 24/7, every day of the week. Okay?
It's like they would be just as convicted over sin if nobody but God saw it,
Right.
as they would if it was played in front of everybody they knew.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. And their attitude is the same. What's in their heart? Remember last week we talked about how that sagacity is a fountain in the heart, and what's in the heart comes up into the mouth, and then it's on the lips, and it comes out of the lips. And we saw how that was exactly the same with what Satan was doing in the Garden of Eden, as what this this earthly, natural, demonic wisdom that filled his heart came out into his mouth and was on his lips. And we talked about, therefore, knowing the terror of the Lord, we persuade men. That's why it's so necessary. Remember those things. So this is talking about the same thing. God's using different words, different pictures, but the message is still the same. It's not on what's on the outside, but it's what's on the inside. Remember, Jesus talked about, you worry about cleaning the outside of the cup, but the inside of the cup is full of dead men's bones or whatever. Clean the inside first. The exact same message. It's contained in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay, so the worship of Jehovah absolutely precludes all forms of idolatry. And we see this in Deuteronomy 6:14. You shall not follow other gods, any of the gods of the peoples who surround you. For the Lord your God in the midst of you is a jealous God. Otherwise, the anger of the Lord your God will be kindled against you, and he will wipe you off the face of the earth. Okay? So, Jehovah, as a jealous God, will not endure any form of idolatry. He severely punishes all forms of idolatry. And Exodus 20 in verse 5 tells us that he punishes idolatry to the third and fourth generations. Okay? If you want to, we could just turn over and read that real quick.
What was the reference again?
Exodus 20 and verse 5.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so in verse 4, he starts out, you shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and the fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments. As a young man, I never really thought about this idea of a heritage of faith that passes blessings on to those who come after, or the result of your sin making 3 and 4 generations after you that they continue to suffer. But the older I get, the more I do think about that. And with working with these children, seeing how these bad behaviors, these how they become ingrained in the family life. They're passed from generation to generation into generation, and to in a very real sense, there has to be a breaking with the family if they break these patterns of behavior, and instead of being involved in self-destructive behaviors, criminal mindset, to leave that behind and to repent and to begin to, I'm not even saying to follow God yet, but to try to live a normal life. There is involved a breaking of relationships. So this worshiping of idols is absolutely forbidden. Now, what happened in the Old Testament and what continues to happen today, it's essentially the very same thing. At first, the children of Israel worshiped physical idols. You remember in Exodus, while Moses was up on the mountain receiving the 10 Commandments, Aaron makes a golden calf. And in Genesis, the Bible starts out, in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. And Elohim with a capital E refers to the God of the Bible, Jehovah, Yahweh. And there, when Aaron makes the golden calf, he says to the children of Israel, "Behold, this is the Elohim who brought you out of Egypt." He puts God's name onto this idol, and they bow down and they worship the idol. And we know, of course, how that resulted. God became very angry, and the punishment that came upon the people. But later, as they went into the promised land, they began to worship the Baals, the Asherah, these other foreign gods that were physically an idol. And because of this, they were carried away into captivity. Now, the period of captivity was such a difficult time, such a heavy, hard punishment, that after they came back from captivity, the Jewish people they didn't anymore worship a physical idol.
Right.
What they did was actually worse and more insidious. They worshiped the God of the Bible as if he was an idol. They treated God as if he was an idol. Now, if fear is the fundamental characteristic of all true worship, and then you worship a God where fear is no longer there, then what you have done is treated God as if he's an idol.
Yeah.
Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, these are very clear about this, particularly where he said, speaking about the idols, "Do not fear them. They can do you no harm. Neither can they do you any good." This is what happened. This is what happened in the book of Malachi. It actually started much earlier than that, but by the time of the book of Malachi, you see a whole book written to the Jewish nation, speaking about what happens when you divorce fear from worship. Okay. Ezekiel 17, 1 through 7. I'm sorry, not Ezekiel, Exodus. Now, I will also confess to you that until I began studying this, I never recognized Exodus 17, 1 through 7 as part of idolatry. That was the root. But as I began to really study this out, it became crystal clear that this is exactly what is happening. In Exodus 17, 1 through 7, this is Massa and Meribah. This is where the children of Israel murmured or complained against God because they had no water. Now, if you have fear of God, are you going to be making a complaint against God? No.
Yes, sir.
And if you look in the book of Exodus and you get the full context, this is right after they have crossed over the Red Sea by dry land, and they have seen God's power as the Egyptian army is swallowed up. Just right after. God has been feeding them with manna, and God has been providing them with water. And so now then, for some reason, God in his eternal purposes decides to let them go a day or two without water. It's a test. It's a test to reveal what's in their heart. God already knows what's in their heart, but the people themselves need to see what's in their hearts for their own selves. And so they get a little thirsty, and the more they get thirsty, the more they begin to grumble and to complain. Now let's go back just a tiny second. What is the third moment in worship, like we just saw in Deuteronomy 6:13? Swearing in his name. What you are in secret when you think nobody's looking is what you really are. The same principle applies. What you are when you're in a very difficult situation reveals who you really are.
Yeah.
And so then all the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin, according to the command of the Lord, encamped at some place, and there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" Okay. We're going to make a parenthesis right here. There's a few things that I can promise you about the fear of the Lord. Number one, if you get serious about studying and trying to learn the fear of the Lord, God is going to send you a series of difficult moments in your life to see if you're really serious or not. They're tests. One of the tests is, do you fear people? Because the fear of man is always a snare. One of the tests is going to be, can you bear fruit in the desert? Very often it comes that God is asking you to serve him and to do certain things, and financially it becomes extremely, extremely difficult. If you had millions and millions and millions of dollars, you wouldn't have to worry about it. And if you bear fruit with millions and millions of dollars in your pocket, no one is surprised. But when you put that fruit tree out in the middle of the desert, and the fruit tree grows green and bears lots of fruit, everyone's going to be wondering what's going on. The way that we are able to bear fruit in the desert is because, first of all, the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. Your life, the roots of your life are drinking from this fountain of water. Psalms 1 talks about it. You're planted by these streams of water. They're invisible streams, but they're still there. When I was in El Paso, this was back about 18, 19 years ago, when I first really was preaching about the fear of the Lord in America, the pastor's son really became excited about it, and about the fear of the Lord. He was going through the Bible study, and he was in his pickup. He had his windows rolled down. He pulled up to a red light, and this guy ran up to the side of his truck and tried to do a carjacking. I don't know if he had a gun or a knife, But he said to the man, he said to this pastor's son, the police are after me. I've got to have your truck. Give it to me. And the man looked at him and said, no, sir, I fear God. If you would like, I will carry you to the police station, but you cannot have my truck. And the man was in shock. And then the pastor's son said, and I live right across the street there. That's my house. I'll be glad to talk to you about God. The light turned green. He drove off. Well, a couple of days later, the man came to his house.
Wow.
They began to talk to him. He says, he called her his girlfriend. It's the girl that he lived with. He says, she needs to hear this. So she came back and talked to them. He had not made as much progress in the fear of the Lord as what you might have hoped. He tried to get them to say the sinner's prayer. And he said, if he told this young couple, if you'll say this sinner's prayer, then everything's good between you and God. The young lady said, no, sir. If the God of the Bible really is a God you should fear, saying a sinner's prayer will not fix the problem of sin. That's pretty amazing. That's the last I know of the story. But it was a test for him. You will be tested. Now, as you grow a little further in the fear of the Lord and you begin to look back, you will see that I was being tested all along, and I didn't even know I was being tested, and I failed the test. But as you grow in the fear of the Lord, of course, your spiritual sight increases. But God will test you. Not because God doesn't know what's in your heart, but because God wants you to know. When we're in need, like these people who are thirsty for water, or when we don't have enough money, when we're in a really, really, really desperate situation, that will reveal by whose name you swear. In other words, it's going to come out. That's what happened here. The people thirsted for water. They grumbled against Moses and said, why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, what shall I do to this people? A little more and they will stone me. And of course, God says to Moses, go and strike the rock. And Moses struck the rock and the water came out. Now later, of course, this same problem occurred. But God said to Moses, speak to the rock. But Moses, being disobedient, did not speak. He struck the rock. And because of that, Moses was not allowed to go into the kingdom, enter the promised land. But on this first time he struck the rock, the water came out. Okay. One of God's names is Jehovah Jireh. I'm sure you've heard of that. The Lord who provides. When they murmur against God, they're calling God a liar. God, you tell us your name is Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides, but we need water. God did provide the water, but he provided it in his own time. And murmuring against God in these difficult times, we're saying, God, you cannot provide for me. And these circumstances are greater and larger than you. And so then they show no fear of God. Now in Deuteronomy 10:20, we've already looked at that. But let's go back and look at it a little further. Remember, we got to these two places because Jesus was quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 6 while he's being tested in the desert. Jesus uses the word fear, worship. The Old Testament that he's quoting uses the word fear. Okay, Deuteronomy 10. verses 20 and 21. We're going to start in we'll just start right there. You shall fear the Lord your God. You shall serve him and cling to him, and you shall swear by his name. He is your praise. He is your God, who has done these great and awesome things. The word in awesome in Hebrew is our general word, Y-A-R-E, for fear. Has done these great and awesome things for you, which your eyes have seen. Remember, just because your eyes have seen it doesn't mean that you know God's character. Okay? So here the holy fear of God manifests itself in three ways. It talks about indeed, in other words, serving God. And we're going to look at this in some detail to try to help you to understand how important it is to worship God in fear. Let's look in the book of Jude first. Well, Brother Roberts preaches a very long series of sermons on the book of Jude. I'm pretty sure that he has preached them in the church in Mississippi, in Kinney's church. I've talked about them before in Smolensk. But the book of Jude talks about these people who are false prophets, preachers, and teachers who have crept in unawares, and now they're doing great damage in the church. Verse 12 is one of them, one of the places where it speaks about this, describing them, starting in verse 11, though they have gone the way of Cain, for pay they have rushed into the error of Balaam and perished in the rebellion of Korah. These are men who are hidden reefs in your love feasts when they feast with you without fear, caring for themselves. Now, the love feast, of course, is the Lord's table. They come to the Lord's table without fear. They have no fear of God in this very holy moment of worshiping God. And he says they're hidden reefs, a reef that is standing above the water. In other words, an open reef. A reef you can see is very beneficial. If you can see the reef, you can see the water that's the passage where you can go from the ocean back behind the protection of the reef. It's very beneficial for ocean-going vessels. But a hidden reef, one that you cannot see, will rip the bottom out of your boat because it's hidden. And that is one of the ways that these false prophets, preachers, and teachers do their damage. You don't know that they're false, and they rip the bottom out of your life. And he said they feast without fear. Now, Psalm 78. Remember, we talked about what's going on with the water. They don't have enough water. We're going to start in Psalm 78. Just to get some of the context, we're gonna start about verse 10. But the part that I want us to really put our attention to starts in about verse 29 through 31. so verse 10, he said, Psalm 78:10, they did not keep the covenant of God. They refused to walk in his law. They forgot his deeds. They forgot his deeds and his miracles that he had shown them. He wrought wonders before their fathers in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan. He divided the sea and caused them to pass through, and he made the waters stand up like a heap. He led them with the cloud by day, and all the night with a light of fire. He split the rocks in the wilderness and gave them abundant drink like the ocean depths. He brought forth streams also from the rock and caused waters to run down like rivers. So we're speaking very early. This is occurring very early after the children of Israel have left Egypt. And when he says they forgot his deeds, he's saying they forget what God is doing for them every day. In the morning when they stand up, there's the pillar of cloud that they can see. At night when they go to bed, there's the pillar of fire that they can see. He's giving them water every day in the desert. And in spite of all these miracles, all these deeds that God has done to them, done for them, verse 17, yet they still continue to sin against him, to rebel against the Most High in the desert. And in their heart, they put God to the test by asking food according to their desire. Then they spoke against God. They said, can God prepare a table in the wilderness? So let's stop at this verse 18 for just a second. By asking food according to their desire. If a person's really, really hungry, how particular are they going to be when you offer them food?
They'll take anything.
Yeah. When we lived in St. Kitts, we bought this. It was a beautiful dog. The most beautiful dog I've ever owned. It was a boxer. His mom and dad came from England. Gorgeous dog. The lady that, and her husband that raised these dogs were very wealthy. And she cooked 3 times a day for this dog when it was a puppy, learning how to eat. She gave him scrambled eggs for breakfast, kippered herring. I mean, she fed him better than I ate. So we brought him home. I had a sack of puppy chow. I put the puppy chow down in his bowl, and he came and he sniffed at it. He says, what's this? And he walked away. I said, buddy, in a couple of days, you're going to think that's pretty tasty. And sure enough, after a day or two, he decided the puppy chow was pretty tasty, and then from then on, he ate it. These people are grumbling because they don't want just food. They want food according to their desire. They've got enough to eat, but they want something more. What God has provided is not satisfying them. That's telling you something about the condition of their heart, not about their appetite. It's not enough that God takes them out of Egypt. It's not enough that they cross the seas. It's not enough that there's the cloud by day and the fire by night. It's not enough that they got water to drink and all the manna they can eat. They want food according to their taste. Then they spoke against God. They said, can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Behold, he struck the rock so that the waters gushed out and the streams were overflowing. Can he give bread also? Will he provide meat for his people? Therefore the Lord heard and was full of wrath. And as fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also mounted against Israel, because they did not believe in God and did not trust in his salvation. They are revealing the unbelief that's in their heart. Now, this has many, many highly significant parallels today. Many people believe they have to do something extra so that God will love them and accept them. They want to have salvation, but on top of that, they want to work for it. They want to earn it. They want to have really good works. They don't trust that God can save them all by himself. We see this play itself out in all manners of modern day church life. Verse 23. So God commanded the clouds above, and he opened the doors of heaven. He rained down manna upon them to eat, and gave them food from heaven. Men did eat the bread of angels. He sent them food in abundance, and more than enough. He caused the east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he directed the south wind. When he rained meat upon them like the dust, even winged fowl like the sands of the sea. Then he let them fall, the birds, in the midst of their camp, round about their dwellings. So they ate and were well filled, and their desire he gave to them. But before they had satisfied their desire, while the food was in their mouths, the anger of God rose against them, and he killed some of their stoutest ones and subdued the choice men of Israel. In spite of all this, they still sinned and did not believe in his wonderful works. And he brought their days to an end in futility, and their years in sudden terror. Now, the word here translated terror is a very specific Hebrew word that speaks about the fear of God. It is almost always used in the negative sense. Okay. They grumbled against God. They had enough to eat, but they wanted something different. God gave it to them, and while it was still in their mouths, they died. Okay. Verse 34. When he killed them, then they sought him and returned and searched diligently for God. And they remembered that God was their rock and the Most High God their Redeemer. But they deceived him with their mouth and lied to him with their tongue. For their heart was not steadfast towards him, nor were they faithful in his covenant. Remember, God said it's always a matter of your heart. This swearing in his name is not taking an oath in a court of law. It's what comes out of your heart, out of your mouth in these ordinary conversations of life. And in this moment, this difficult moment, even when God gave them what they asked for, they continued to deceive God with their mouth, and they lied to him with their tongues, and their heart was not steadfast. Okay? Okay. Oh. We'll look at, I have a whole list of scriptures that go along with this. It's just the same point over and over and over again. We'll just go one more, and then we'll call it quits for tonight. Okay. Isaiah 56:10 is 10 and 11 is where we're going to read, but we need to look at verse 9. Now, this is really sad. This is when they are worshiping God and treating God like an idol. In Exodus, God gives the beasts, these birds, to them for food. But now, as for judgment, God says to the beasts, all ye beasts of the field, all you beasts in the forest, come to eat. Why? His watchmen are blind. Remember, the ability to see, the verb to see and the verb to fear are linked together, can't be separated. Two different words, but they're related. There's no longer any fear. They're blind. All of them know nothing. All of them are mute dogs, unable to bark. They're dreamers lying down who love to slumber. All the dogs are greedy. They're not satisfied. They are shepherds who have no understanding. They have all turned to their own way, each to his unjust gain, to the last one. Come, they say, let us get wine and let us drink heavily of strong drink, and tomorrow will be like today, even more so. Now you will remember Jesus took this same idea and he spoke about the man who was really rich and he had a super big harvest, and he said, what am I going to do? I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger barns. And he said, your soul is required of you this night. It's the same picture that from here that Jesus uses in the New Testament, all speaking about the same thing. These people who claim to serve God, but by deed, by their actions, they are proving that they swear falsely. That in times of difficulty, these other times, what is really in their heart comes out. They're swearing falsely. Okay? Now, then the second place in the New Testament where Jesus uses the word worship, and the Old Testament place he's quoting is the word fear, is Matthew chapter 15. And this one is one of the, to me, most powerful places that speaks about this problem. So let's start in Matthew 15, verse 9. Notice that this starts out by referring to swearing falsely. Matthew 15, starting in verse 8, or verse 7. You hypocrites, rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. And then Jesus goes on and explains it. After Jesus called the crowd to him, he said to them, hear and understand. It is not what enters into the mouth that defiles the man, but what proceeds out of his mouth. This defiles the man. Okay, you see that? He's still referring to swearing falsely from Deuteronomy. But now he's quoting Isaiah 29:13. So let's go to Isaiah 29:13 and see exactly what it was that Jesus was quoting. and the context of it. But let's back up to verse 9, Isaiah 29:9, so we get a little bit of the context. I think Anton for sure is going to remember, and I'm thinking maybe Penny will remember. Brother Roberts spoke a series of messages on spiritual drunkenness.
Yes, I do believe that. I remember that. Yes.
Right. Okay. And he said that spiritual drunkenness is one of the last remedial judgments that God gives, trying to get the people to turn back to him.
Right.
Okay. Isaiah 29 speaks about spiritual drunkenness starting in verse 9. And then we're going to read the part that Jesus quoted. But this is a very important moment that we need to understand. God says to the people through the prophet Isaiah, be delayed and wait. Blind yourselves. You see that? Blind yourselves and be blind. They become drunk, but not with wine. They stagger, but not with strong drink. For the Lord has poured over you a spirit of deep sleep. He has shut your eyes, the prophets. He has covered your heads, the seers. The entire vision will be to you like the words of a sealed book, which when they give it to the one who is literate, saying, please read this, he will say, I cannot, for it is sealed. Then the book will be given to the one who is illiterate, saying, please read this, and he will say, I cannot read. Then the Lord said, because this people draws near with their words and honor me with their lip service, but they remove their hearts from me, and their reverence, which is the word fear, of me, fear for me consists of traditions learned by rote. Therefore, behold, I will once again deal marvelously with this people, wondrously marvelous, and the wisdom of their wise men will perish, and the discernment of their discerning men will be concealed. Woe to those who deeply hide their plans from the Lord, and whose deeds are done in a dark place, and they say, who sees us, or who knows us? You turn things around. Shall the potter be considered as equal with the clay, that which is made would say to its maker, he did not make me? Or what is formed say to him who formed it, he has no understanding. Okay. So Jesus spoke, he was quoting from verse 13, but we need to get the whole context. So we read that whole part. Now then, in verse 13, God says, they honor me with their lip service. The Hebrew word there is the word kabad. It is the exact same word as found in Malachi chapter 1 and verse 6. And I'm going to read it to you real quick. It is the word for honor. It literally means the word wait. Speaks about wait. So I told you wrong. It was verse 5. Oh. Malachi 1:6. I told you right. I turned to the wrong place. A son honors his father. It's the same word. Their honor for me in Isaiah is lip service. Every son honors his father. Every servant honors his master. Then God said, but if I am a father, where is my honor? And if I am a master, where is my New American? It says respect. What does it say? Does anybody have King James or some other version?
I believe it's fear.
Fear. Okay. The word there is actually a very powerful Hebrew word, M-O-R-A. It's one of the most powerful forms of the fear of God that there is. The word M-O-R-A refers to the mighty hand and outstretched arm that God used to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt. It's the word that talks about these powerful deeds of God. So he says, a son, any son would honor his father. Every servant will honor his master. If I'm your father, where is my honor? And if I'm a master, where is this very strong form of the fear of the Lord that you owe me? The Bible clearly teaches that we owe this kind of fear, this fear of God that Jesus calls worship. We owe that to God. It is the debt that is owed by all those who have been redeemed. We have an obligation to give to God that worship that is due him. Okay. Now, so they know their honor for God is lip service. Their hearts have been very far removed from God, so they have forgotten the very basics of worship, because worship starts with fearing God that comes out of your heart and by swearing truly. This place also refers back to 2 Kings 17. I'm sure many of you will remember this place. 2 Kings 17. When Israel fell, we're talking about the northern tribes, when they fell and they were carried away captive, then the land was empty. The land that they previously had occupied was empty because they've been carried away captive. So the king of Assyria brought people in, and they took over Samaria. And in verse 25, at the beginning of their living there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. And so then they make a complaint to the king of to the king of Assyria. He said, okay, we have to go find some of these priests that were carried away captive, and let them, verse 27, in the very end of the verse, let them teach them the custom of the God of the land. Now, he's smart enough to realize that these lions coming was a spiritual punishment, a spiritual problem. He wasn't smart enough to realize they need to return to the God that created everything. He just thinks it's an idol. So verse 28, so one of the priests whom they had carried away into exile from Samaria came and lived at Bethel and taught them how they should fear the Lord. Now, this is a very different kind of teaching people how to fear the Lord than what David did when he says, come, my children, listen to me, and I will teach the fear of the Lord. How do we know that? Verse 29, but every nation still made gods of its own. Once you have learned the fear of the Lord like what David taught you, never again go back to idolatry. These people did. Verse 32, so they also feared the Lord. and appointed from among themselves priests of the high places who acted for them. Verse 33, they feared the Lord and served their own gods, and they did not fear God as was commanded in that we read there in Deuteronomy. And so it ends up they served God and served idols. They feared the Lord and served idols. This is traditions. This is traditions learned of men, learned by rote. That's what Jesus is talking about. They've removed their hearts far from me. They've learned the fear of God as a tradition, something that you would do to show respect for an idol, but their hearts are far from me. And the true fear of God is always a matter of their heart. Okay, is that clear, or do I need to go back over it?
That's good.
I'm sorry.
That was good for me.
Okay. Now then, let's go back to Isaiah. This next part is a little hard. Don't want to think about it. Okay, the Isaiah 29, 9 through 12, where he's talking about be delayed, blind yourselves and be blind, become drunk but not with wine. One of the characteristics of idolatry, those who practice idolatry become spiritually blind. So Kyle and Delish tell us this stupefaction of verse 9 and 10, becoming stupid, becoming blind. This stupefaction was the self-inflicted punishment of the dead works with which the people mocked God and deceived themselves. All worship and all praise done without the holy fear of God is dead works. And the consequence is self-inflicted punishment of making yourself spiritually blind, spiritually drunk. The Bible calls it falling into a dead sleep spiritually. When we continue in it, verse 10, the Lord then pours over you a spirit of deep sleep. The judgment that comes for those whose heart swears falsely in worship, and there is no fear of God included in that worship. At first, we do it to ourselves, but then second, God does it even more. So the punishment starts with ourselves, but if we continue in it, then God just continues it. Remember, the holy fear of God is always first, most, and primary. It's always a matter of the heart. Remember, God puts that special kind of fear of God in our hearts. This is the fear of God that existed between Adam and Eve and God. It's the way God created it to be. It is always, first and foremost, a matter of heart. Okay? Jeremiah 32:40, we've read that several times, where God says, I will put this special fear in their hearts so they will not depart from me. Here, they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Exactly opposite of how it should be. Now then, if we go back to Psalm 50 and also Psalm 78, but we're going to notice something. Psalm 50 and Psalm 78 are both Psalms of ASAPH, a Psalm of Asaph. So ever since the time of Asaph, this lamentation and condemnation of hypocritical worship or ceremonial worship or worship that is mere ceremony not done in the holy fear of God has been condemned. We don't know when before that it became a major theme of preaching and teaching in the Old Testament saints. But we can say for absolutely sure, beginning with the time of this man Asaph. Now, the opposite of this is Psalm 5 and verse 7. We've talked about it before, but we're going to keep going back to it. It has to become part of the way we think. But as for me, by your abundant loving kindness, I will enter your house. At your holy temple, I will bow in fear of you. Now, it's speaking about other places that refer to this same verse, speak about pay our vows. And the word here where it says, at your holy temple, I will bow in fear of you, is that special fear of God that's speaking about what God puts in our hearts when we become, when he gives us the new heart. In thy fear, with that fear that you put in my heart, when you gave me the new heart, I will bow in reverence to you. You see the relationship there? Okay. Isaiah 86, I'm sorry, Psalm 86:11 says, unite my heart that I would fear your name. Psalm 27 tells us, he makes this abundantly clear. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the defense of my life. Whom shall I dread? When evildoers come upon me to devour my flesh, my adversaries and my enemies, they stumbled and fell. Though a host encamp against me, my heart will not fear. Though war arise against me, in spite of this, I shall be confident. Remember, the fear of the Lord is our strong confidence. One thing I have asked from the Lord that I shall seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to meditate in his temple. So we could see both the positive and the negative. The positive is always including this fear of God. Okay. When David is praying, is worshiping God in fear, he's praying for God to unite his heart so that he will always fear God. Okay. Let's go back to Psalm 5:7 for just a tiny second. We've talked about this before, but let's just go back one more time. Worship and fear are always matters of the heart and relationship with God. And he wants David wants God, he wants to always have this fear. Then in verse 8, he says, "O Lord, lead me in righteousness because of my foes. Make your way straight before me. There is nothing reliable in what they say. Their inward part is destruction itself. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with the tongue. Hold them guilty, O God," and so on down. He's recognizing that those in the world live one way and that there would be a temptation for him to leave God, but he wants to stay with God. Okay. Any other questions there? Okay, so this worship that done in without fear is condemned by Asaph. It's also condemned by Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. In the time of Hezekiah and Josiah, this was the big problem. Okay.
Could we, I think you said Psalm 50 and Psalm 78 were from Asaph condemning that kind of worship. Is that correct?
Yeah. Right. Let's go back to, I'm sorry, I sort of got, I got distracted here. There was a lot of noise in the house. Okay, Psalm 78. Let's go back to verse 36 and 37. We looked at it just earlier in the lesson, but this 36 and 37, it makes it to me very clear and easy to understand this connection between what's in your heart and swearing falsely and worship of God that Jesus is talking about to the Pharisees and Sadducees in his day, which also applies in our day and was also in their day. Okay. But they deceived him, God, with their mouth. They lied to him with their tongue, for their heart was not steadfast towards him, nor were they faithful in his covenant. See that?
Yes.
And David is praying, "Unite my heart, that I will always fear your name." And that is a prayer that I say for myself very, very often. And when I'm praying for those, my students and those that I love, I pray that God always, that's a continual prayer, that God would unite their hearts, that they would always fear him. Okay, now, let me just read you some other things, and then we will come down to the very last to see how it applies in our day. But it's important, first of all, that we understand the basic relationship between worship and fear, between these three steps, these three moments from Deuteronomy 6. That's important that we understand that. Second, to understand that when we get away from that, we blind ourselves, and then God takes that blindness even further. That's where we sort of are today. If you you can go lots and lots of places trying to find people who can teach about the fear of God, and you won't find it. It's basic. It's universally basic throughout the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that we have done this has happened is because our worship was with our lips and not with our heart. We blinded ourselves, then God blinded us on top of that. Okay. Worship without fear is hypocritical. It's ceremonial worship. It has no living faith, no striving after holiness, and is a leading theme of prophecy. Now that almost describes today, particularly when we talk about this striving after holiness. Second, the people have stopped the public worship of idols, but they worship Jehovah the exact same way they worship the idols. They worshiped without holy fear. They worshiped with false statements, saying right words, but their words and their hearts said two different things. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Their attitude towards Jehovah and the way they treated him was exactly the same way that they treated the idols. Okay? Now, it is true that sometimes our worship is conscious hypocrisy. Sometimes it's unconscious hypocrisy, but the result is the same. Sometimes we worship, attend church because of the fear of men. The fear of men, remember, is always unholy. It is always a trap or a snare. Sometimes we worship because we're seeking the favor of men. We want them to think well of us. You know, in the South for a long time, if you wanted to be a successful businessman, you needed to be a member of a church because there was benefits there. Sometimes it's unconscious hypocrisy. People who come to church, but there has never been an inward conversion. They come with an unchanged heart. They come to worship because they seek righteousness. They're wanting to earn their righteousness and earn salvation. Those who are content with self-righteousness, this is how they worship. They don't want the righteousness that comes from Christ. They want their own righteousness. And they take pride in their outward fulfillment of the law. Now, there is among some members of what we would normally think of evangelical Christians who are trying to go back to Christianity plus obeying the law, fulfilling all the laws, the Old Testament laws. So they'll start eating only kosher food. They'll have a kosher kitchen. They'll do all of these things trying to gain some kind of righteousness, and they take great pride in the fact that they're better than others because they do Christ plus the law. Okay. Now, Jehovah alienates himself from all of these types of worship. This type of worship is self-alienating, and it must be so because God, we say to be worshiping God, but we alienate God from by our very efforts, and we blind ourselves. When Christians, or those who call themselves Christians, do this, there's three things that happen always. Number one, there is the judgment of the hardening of hearts. We saw this in Isaiah. They did it to themselves first. Then the Holy Spirit begins to harden their hearts. This judgment of hardening. Number two, he kills their wisdom. Number three, he kills their discernment. Number two and number three happen by removing all of the characteristics of Isaiah 11, 1 through 3 from the congregation. Remember, Isaiah 11, 1 through 3 is these 7 characteristics that describe the Spirit that was on Christ, that would also describe the Holy Spirit. When knowledge of that is lost, and that's no longer preached or taught, then that is God killing their wisdom and killing their discernment. Okay, this hardening because of worship without fear so completely empties and confuses them that even the appearance of wisdom and unity of the leaders completely disappears, and we end up with leaders who have no knowledge of the fear of God. Therefore, knowing the terror of the Lord, we persuade men, is lost. It's no longer a standard. And that is the result of God's judgment on us. Because at first we did it to ourselves, but then later God does it to us. Okay? So an understanding of this and a returning to God with all of our hearts, with seeking the fear of God, having a desire for it. Remember, we talked about Adam, in the temptation of Adam and Eve, their desire was for sin. Isaiah 11, I don't want to misquote it. I'm just going to turn to it real quick. Desire for sin. Delighting in sin was how Satan tempted Adam and Eve. But the Spirit that is on Christ produces in us a delight in the fear of the Lord. Okay. How will we know that God has begun to send revival? We will see people, churches, pastors, preachers, Bible teachers, who once again begin to delight in the fear of the Lord. It will bring about a renewal of what God has. It will be because God has brought a renewal, and the Spirit that was on Christ really is upon the members of the church. Okay. I think you can understand how this is very serious, yes?
Definitely.
Yeah. And how it's completely lost. Okay. Let me turn back to the Matthew passage. Okay. Matthew, Jesus says, "But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men." Yes?
Which was the verse? Sorry.
That's Matthew 15:9.
9.
Yes. Now then, there's a verse in Colossians hardly anybody ever pays any attention to. Colossians chapter 2, verse 18. In my lifetime, I've never heard anybody mention this in a sermon. Although in some of the old sermons that I've read and studied, they do talk about it. Colossians 2. Now it's talking about these people that are looking for their own righteousness. And he talks about if you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, this is Colossians 2:20. Why, as if you were living in the world, do you submit yourselves to decrees such as, do not handle this, do not taste, do not touch, which all refer to things destined to perish with use in accordance with the commandments and teachings of men. Now then, verse 23. These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom. Now, in New American Standard, after the appearance of wisdom comes self-made religion. In King James, I actually like the word better there. In King James, it's called will worship. The appearance of wisdom in will worship. Will worship is when what happens in worship is done to please you or to please the congregation. Okay. You ever heard of a thing called a cowboy church?
Mm-hmm. Wow.
It's done to please the cowboys.
Yeah.
Yeah. Among Southern Baptists, it's considered the most vibrant part of the church right now. They say it's the only part of the Southern Baptists that's growing.
Wow.
It's will worship. Or we're going to have this heavy rock kind of music because that's what appeals to the people. But it's called worship is what appeals and is pleasing to God. And so the New Testament talks about it. It has the appearance of wisdom. It's just the appearance. It can be very successful in drawing large crowds of lost people. Has the appearance of wisdom in self-made religion. Teaching as commandments, the tradition of men. It's a huge problem today. Okay. Any questions?
Yeah, that's the first time I've thought of that verse in a modern context, because back then they were teaching for commandments, the traditions that they had built up around the Mosaic Law.
That's correct.
The Talmud and the Mishnah and things that were based, built around Moses' law.
Right.
In a modern context, we adhere to doing things because they're traditional.
Right.
Regardless of their conformity to the commandments.
And because we like them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't made that connection before, but it's a modern equivalent.
Right. Yes. And Ephesians 5:10 is the opposite if you want to read the opposite of will worship. Ephesians 5:10 tells us, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord.
Wow.
That's the exact opposite of will worship.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can learn what God's trying to say when you look at the opposite of it. Okay?